Hello everyone, this is Hank. Today I'm going to talk about depth of field. Everything you ever need to know depth of field and more. Okay, I'm gonna give it to you in presentation format. And it's gonna be a long one. What I'm going to do is gonna put the timeline in for different topics, in the description so that you can skip to the appropriate one and make it better for review, just in case you want to go back. By the way, if you haven't, please subscribe and like. If you could, I really appreciate that. Positive feedback is very nice. Okay, so what is depth of field? Per definition, when we talk about depth of field, we are talking about the distance in front of the point of focus. In this example, the point of focus is where the yellow line is. So the distance in front and the distance behind the point of focus, that is, in the technical term, in acceptable focus or acceptably sharp. Same thing, right? And we all know that the depth of field is controlled by aperture. If you don't know that, after this presentation, you will know, right? But I think most of us photographers already know that. Okay, in this example, if you set the aperture value to something small, like 2.8, your depth of field is going to be less than if you had set it at f16. Okay? So that's how you control depth of field, which is the range that things are sharp in your picture, or vice versa, things that are not sharp, right? And that we get into bokeh, and we will talk a little bit more about bokeh later. All right. Okay, let's explore depth of field a little bit more. There's such a thing called depth of field ratio. Okay, now it's not always true, but for a lot of lenses, the way that it works is like if you focus on your subject here, okay, then your subject is in focus. Normally, the range of sharpness or depth of field is that it will be sharp half of the distance in front and double the distance in the back. Okay, so normally in front of the point of focus is half of the distance behind it. Okay, so that's usually how it works. It is not always true, but for a lot of cases it is true. And this is why that on the second bullet, okay, you often hear advices when people ask, like, yeah, I want to take a picture of landscape, where should I focus? And you hear it, and advices are a lot of advices, especially on the internet, correct? And so you often hear advice that, oh yeah, you focus 1/3 into the picture. And if you ever wonder why people are saying that, is because of this kind of like a tidbit of fact. It's like, see, if you divide this thing into 2/3, 1/3 in front is in focus, 2/3 in front in the back is also in focus. So if you focus 1/3 into the picture, then you're hoping that everything is in focus. Now, that advice is only half true, because it doesn't really address whether or not you have adequate depth of field, right? And that's a purpose. Today I'm going to try to clear it up, like what exactly is depth of field and how are you affecting it so that you get everything you want in a picture. So hopefully that's a tall order, but I'm going to try to convey that to you. Start out with, I'm going to give you a set of examples to show you the effect of aperture on depth of field. As I mentioned, all of us understand that. Okay, but it doesn't hurt to repeat what it means. Okay, so in this example, I'm using the same focal length, I'm using the same ISO, and I'm varying the aperture value and just let the speed catch up with it, right, to maintain the same exposure. So basically right now I took this picture at f22 because it's a high aperture value. It kind of fits into our understanding is that everything's in focus. So pretty much beginning to end, everything's in acceptable focus, acceptable sharpness. Right? In the back it's not as sharp as in the front, but it's acceptable. That's just why people don't use sharp, because there are different degrees of sharp, right? As long as it's acceptable. Okay, so now skip forward and I set the aperture to 5.6, as you can see that between f22 and f5.6 a huge difference. The background's already blurred, you could barely see what it is. Now if I further decrease the value of the aperture to 1.8, as you can see that I got a really blurred background. And so to control the depth of field and the bokeh associated with it, I changed the aperture. Now all photographers know this, correct? Okay, so let's kind of play a little guessing game here. So what do you think this aperture would be for this example? Now the analysis shows that, hey, the background is very well blurred, not completely blurred, but blurred enough. So if you guess that this is f2.8, you would be correct. It's 2.8. Okay, at focal length of 65 millimeter. I'll tell you the significance of that a little later, right? Okay, so next one. What about this picture? Analysis says everything appear to be in focus, all the way in front and back. So everything is in focus. So you would guess that the aperture is pretty high, aperture value. Then you would be correct, because I took it at f9. So everything's in acceptable focus. Okay, so now what about this picture? Analysis says that the background is pretty well blurred. The foreground is also blurred. There's a very narrow band that is in reasonable focus, which is where the B is, right? So if you guess, what do you think? f1.8, 1.4, 2.8? Well, you would be wrong. I took this at f8. Still blurred. It's a blurred mess, really. What about this one? You can see this I took in Osaka, Japan, in the famous bamboo forest. As you can tell, everything in this picture appears to be in reasonable focus. Everything is kind of sharp, right? So what would you say? f8, f11, f16? Well, if you guessed that, you would be wrong. This was taken at f2.8. Okay, I hope you are surprised like I intended you to. How about this picture? This I took at in Copenhagen, Denmark. I was on a moving boat, by the way, and that's why the speed was set to 1/400. Now, because of bamboo forest, if you guess the aperture was 2.8, again, you would be correct. I took this at 2.8. As you can see that everything in front all the way to the back appear to be in reasonable sharpness. Yet, the aperture is 2.8. And that is what I wanted to press the point to you, is like aperture is not the only game in town. It's not. So we need to understand what it is we are dealing with. There are actually three main ways of controlling depth of field. Aperture is only one of them. Okay, so the second factor, which is just as important, people don't think about it in that term, but it is, all three is just equally important. The second one outside of aperture is distance to the subject. Distance meaning between you and the subject, or rather between the camera and the subject. I'm making the assumption that you are with the camera. Okay, so the distance to subject is really important. So the closer the camera is to the subject, the less depth of field it is, meaning that the range of focus is less. Right? The third one is like depending on your focal length. If you have a lower focal length, okay, the smaller number, for example, like say if you have a zoom lens of 24 to 105 millimeter, 24 would be less focal length. 105 would be the most focal length, right? So if you set it to 24 millimeter, your depth of field is going to be a lot deeper or wider than if you set it to 105. Given everything else the same, okay, just changing the focal length is going to affect that. So remember this very important concept. And quite a few people get this, but there's always a few that don't. So I just want to make sure you understand that there's more to depth of field than just the aperture. Okay, quickly, we already talked about aperture effect, right? Those three that I showed you earlier. Now, we're going to give you an example on the effect of distance. So here, I kept everything the same. Focal length the same, aperture is the same. The only difference is the distance here. and the speed's the same too. I just didn't put the speed down. But okay, so this is at 10 feet. Okay, as far as depth of field is concerned, you can still make out what the background looked like, even though it's kind of blurred, right? Because it was taken at f1.8. Now if I move to 6 feet, you can see that the background is further blurred. And I haven't changed anything else, just the distance. Of course, you know, the subject looked bigger because I'm closer. That is a given. Now I move to 3 feet. Okay, of course the subject is even bigger, but look at the background. Background is completely blurred. You can't even tell what's behind it. Barely, right? Here you can. Here you even can better. So by varying the distance, your depth of field will change. Okay. Similarly, if you change the focal length, look what happened here. I'm using a zoom lens. So at 50 millimeter, you look at the background, right? It's kind of blurred, but you can still make out what's behind you, right? Now, I changed it to 100 millimeter. Now, background is a lot more blurred. You can still kind of make out that there's a water fountain behind, but very difficult. Now, I zoom in to 400 millimeter. Guess what happened? Okay, between that, and of course, remember the perspective doesn't change because I changed the distance, I think. Okay, so even the distance vary. Look at what happened. Backgrounds change a lot. Okay, so those are the three factors, and I already gave you an example. Right, so if you remember anything at all, remember that, hey, you know, aperture change affect the depth of field. Closer you are to the subject, you change the depth of field, make it shallower, closer, shallower, keep that in mind. And then more depth of field, closer, shorter the depth of field. Okay, so you remember those three things. Now there's another one. Now we started talking about bokeh. Well, a lot of people pronounce it differently. I look up a dictionary and they pronounce it bokeh, and that's just happened to be the way I pronounce it too. If you can say bokeh, I'm not going to complain. Whatever. So the bokeh is, you know, the degree of blurriness that you have, and it talks more about the quality of it, right? So it has nothing to do with depth of field. It is related, but depth of field is depth of field, bokeh is bokeh, right? But normally you can affect the bokeh, okay, meaning the blurriness, by doing an extra thing outside of the 3 factor. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that if you want it to be more blurred, or at least perceived blurred, more bokeh, is that you need to move the background farther than your subject, farther from your subject. Because you think about it, even at f1.8 and 1.2, if you are leaning your model against your background, like say a wall, and you set it at aperture 1.2, you can still see the wall very well. The fact is that because it's so close to the subject, and it is within the depth of field. That's why you don't want that. So you want to separate your model or subject away from your background if you want the background to be blurred. So that is different from the 3 factors, but it's kind of related. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay. Okay. Now the next bullet is, like, you probably, in the course of discussion about photography on the internet, you will hear people throw this term around a lot. It's like, you say, but I have a full frame, so I have better depth of field than your camera, which is a crop sensor, that sort of thing. And people say that a lot. You know, technically it is kind of correct, but it's correct because the full frame camera, because there's no magic between full frame versus crop. Okay, the difference comes in is because full frame you can see more. Therefore, if you want to have the same field of view, you have to move the camera a lot closer than you would with a crop sensor camera. Therefore, because you move closer, you get better depth of field because you move closer, not because it is a full frame camera. You know what I mean? But the end result is the same. It's like, yeah, you do have a little bit more depth of field for the same field of view. I hope that makes sense. And then some people, like the math guy, we talk about, yeah, you know, like full frame got better circle of confusion, is smaller, therefore this and that. Now, while technically it is true that it affects depth of field, but the level of effect is so minuscule that it's just a math guy talking. In practicality, you can ignore it. Okay, so let's not even bother about circle of confusion in this talk. All right? Okay. Now, just to give you an example of the difference. So I took 2 pictures. One picture is with the crop sensor, and the other one with a full frame. So I'm trying to keep the field of view is the same for both picture here the best I can. Okay, so I'm going to go back and forth, so don't worry. Okay, so that is with the cropped. Right? With the full frame, if you really look close, okay, you can kind of see that the depth of field or the bokeh, it's more blurred. Okay, so full frame, more blurred than the crop sensor. That's what they're talking about. So if you have full frame, your bokeh or your depth of field is better. It's yes and no, right? And I kind of explained that. But I just want you to understand this, so that, because people throw this out a lot. Okay, before we go any further, let's go back and explore the pictures that was kind of a surprise. So let's go back. I got to go back quite a way. Sorry. Okay, these. Okay, let's talk about this guy. Okay, why was this thing at f8? Because everything is blurred. So your depth of field is razor thin, is within the width of the B. It's absolutely shallow, right? And I took it at f8. Now the reason is twofold, right? The first reason is that my focal length is 100 millimeter. That's a telephoto lens. So that is one out of the three factors: focal length, telephoto, very shallow depth of field, and you are seeing it here. Okay. The second factor is that I was pretty close. The B is tiny, right? You've seen a real B, it's tiny. So to get this field of view here of the B, I was maybe a foot away from it. Okay, so therefore the distance to the subject is really close. So I have these two factors that totally outweigh the aperture factor, which is f8. So f8 don't even play a role in this at all. If I had shot this at f16, I won't affect the outcome of the picture too much, just a tiny bit. Okay, so that is the explanation why this thing is such a surprise. If you only think about aperture, and then this picture make no sense. But now that we think about the other two factors, this picture makes sense. Right? So you hear a lot of advices on the internet, and they said, oh yeah, when you're taking a picture of a bird, you know, set it to f16. I kind of disagree with that, because the difference between f8 or f5.6 and f16 is like you gain 2 inches of depth of field if you're lucky, maybe an inch. Okay, and you sacrifice so much light for doing that, so it doesn't really make sense to do it. So most experienced wildlife people, that's why they shoot wide open. They always shoot at the lowest aperture possible, because to increase it, you're not gaining much of anything. Okay, but that is besides the point. Okay, so let's go to this one. Why is this a surprise? The reason this is surprise is because to get the depth of field like this, you would think you need like f8 or f11 or f16. But what I have going for me in this picture is the other two factors. Number one, I'm fairly far from the point of focus. As a matter of fact, I'm like 20 feet away from it. Okay. So I'm far away from the point of focus, number one. Number 2 is like my focal length is fairly low. Okay, so these two factors outweighs the aperture factor again. So because of this, later we're going to talk about hyperfocal distance. And indeed, I focus this picture at its hyperfocal distance. And therefore, half of the distance between that, which happened to be like 20 feet, I focus at 20 feet or so. So 10 feet in front of it is in focus. Everything behind it is in focus, all the way to infinity. And this is what you're seeing even at f2.8. Okay, we will explore that a little further. Okay, so surprise if you just think about aperture value, but if you know about these other two, you shouldn't be surprised at this picture, is what I'm trying to get at. Alright, same goes here. Okay, at 26 millimeter here, the focus is around 20-30 feet hyperfocal. That is exactly where I focus. I focus at this one here. And I know that half of it is in focus. Half of the distance, 15-20 feet or so. Okay, you see that right around me is not very well focused, but the rest of it is in reasonable focus. And all the way back here is in reasonable focus. Okay, so 2.8 is no surprise. Okay, let's move to this current slide. Okay, so we are back. Now, so we talk a lot about depth of field. And the biggest problem us photographers would say, like, oh yeah, okay, well, you talk about depth of field, like, how am I going to be able to tell when I take a picture? What if I don't have my phone with me and I'm too busy to look it up, this and that, and I don't have a chart with me, and how do I know, you know, what conditions to set? Okay, now, in most cameras, right, you can see what the depth of field is. Okay, I'm going to stick with just the 3 brands of camera that I'm more familiar with: Canon, Nikon, and Sony. I'm sorry if you use some other one, because I can't really talk about those, because I don't know enough about them. But for Canon and Nikon, right, and it's a little bit of generalization, but for Canon and Nikon, in order for you to see the real depth of field, you have to press a preview button. Some camera have a built-in preview button. Some camera you use one of the unused button and then you program it to be the field of view button. And then you can view the depth of field and see for yourself before you take a picture. Now with Sony mirrorless cameras, they made that into the equation. So what you see on the Viewfinder or the LCD is what you get for Sony. So depth of field is encrypted in there, so you can see the depth of field real time. You don't even have to press a button. Okay? So that's how you can tell. Okay, let's talk about hyperfocal distance, because you hear this term thrown around a lot, and I don't think people do it on purpose, but if you don't know what it is, you kind of feel kind of inadequate or embarrassed or something. Don't be. It's really easy, and here I'm going to tell you what it is and how to use it. Okay, so by definition, the hyperfocal distance is the distance that you focus at. Okay, and if you focus at the hyperfocal distance, this is what you will get. What you get is like behind the point of focus, all the way to infinity, everything is going to be sharp. or technical term, acceptably sharp, reasonable sharp. Okay, they use different terms, but basically it said that sharp enough, all the way to infinity. Okay, and half of the distance between you and the point of focus will be also acceptably in focus or sharp. Okay, you see this picture here? So you focus at 30 feet, which is the hyperfocal distance, right? 29.46. You focus here. 15 feet away from you will be in focus, all the way to infinity. Okay, so if you know what the hyperfocal distance is, and if you can focus there, you know that everything behind half of the distance in front between you and the subject, and everything behind is going to be in acceptable focus. So that's really useful to know. And the two pictures that I showed you earlier, because I focused at the hyperfocal distance, everything's in focus, even though I use f2.8. Okay, so you don't have to remember the formula, but the formula is basically, you see the variable, it affects the focal length, the aperture number, okay, is in the thing. Now, we talked a little bit about circle confusion, and I told you to ignore that. And the reason is, and they say, yeah, circle of confusion has something to do with the depth of field, and that is true, except that this effect is so minuscule that you can usually ignore it for most practical purposes. But the full frame camera does have a smaller circle of confusion, therefore the depth of field is smaller. Okay? Alright, so let's explore how you effectively use it. Okay, you can create a chart like this for yourself using the formula, or you can go on the internet and get this. As a matter of fact, I get this from the internet. Somebody already made that. Okay, so using the formula, so you have the focal length here, the aperture here, and you assume a certain circle of confusion. And it varies very little, but for crop sensor and full frame. But for all practical purposes, it's the same. Now, the chart, okay, however, this chart is for full frame. The reason that you can't really use this chart for crop sensors, because you have to multiply 1.5 to these numbers, okay, because the field of view is different by 1.5 crop factor. Okay, so this chart here is for full frame, right? Okay, so for full frame camera, which I happen to use to take the pictures that I showed you earlier, okay, for the bamboo forest, it was near 35. It's between 28 and 35 here. So, and I think at the time I focused at 30, which is even better, right? I can focus at 50 if I wanted to, but 30 is even better. And 15 feet in front of me, right, at f2.8, because I wanted to use f2.8. That's the smallest value that I can set with the lens that I was using, which is a 24-70 at the time. So, and I just frame it, and it just happened to be 32 or something like that. So at 2.8, right, so I just focus around 30. And then everything behind it is in focus. And like 15 feet in front of me is in focus as well. So I was able to get the picture. Now for the Copenhagen picture, I was at 24 millimeter. So focusing at 22 or even 30, okay, I can use 2.8. And that's basically what this chart tells you, right? So you don't have to set it at f8, f11. Even though if you set it, it's even better. But you don't have to. All right? Now, luckily, nowadays, like, oh, before I say that, okay, now depth of field can be calculated easily, right? So look at this bullet here, the second bullet first. Now, luckily, because we got our phone with us, and the phone is also a computer, you can load a phone app, and it will calculate all of this for you easily, right? So we always have it at the tip of for use. I was going to say tip of our tongue, but that would be inappropriate. Just a tidbit of info, right? The modern cameras, they do away with a lot of things because they figure that you have your phone with you. The modern camera, all it tells you is like the focus distance. That's it. It doesn't tell you anything else. This will be helpful too, you know, so that you know where it is at 20 feet or 30 feet or what have you. But so the modern lens don't tell you a whole lot, right? But the older lens, because you didn't have a computer, you didn't have a phone that can calculate, so it gives you right on the lens. For example, you look at this. In this example, right, the focus is at 30 feet or 28 feet or something like that. It's telling you that if you set it at f8, you are at a hyperfocal distance. Infinity focus. That is what it means. f4 is not cutting it, f8 cutting it. So if I set this thing to f8, I get the whole enchilada focusing at 30. That is what it means. Okay, so f8 is the magic number. It tells you. This is a whole calculator in itself right here. Okay, there's like hundreds of these different programs. I just give you one example. I'm not affiliated with these people by any means, except that I'm using theirs, depth of field simulator, and you can get it from any phone or the PC or the Mac. Okay, something like this, right? It lets you enter in the make and model, and it knows whether or not it's a crop sensor or full frame, and that's why it asks you this. It asks you the lens because each the circle of confusion would be a little bit different, maybe, right? Okay, and then you can simulate it. You can put what's the aperture setting, what is the distance, okay, and it will tell you what the depth of field is. In this extreme example, I'm pretty close. I'm only like 4 feet away, even though I'm using f8, right? And I'm using 100 millimeter. Guess what? This is an example for the B that I earlier told you. So I shot at f8 here. Now I'm about 4 feet away, right? And look at the depth of field. 1.5 inch in front, 1.5 inch behind. Tiny, tiny little depth of field, and that's why you don't see much. Everything else is blurred. And hyperfocal distance is so far away that it renders the hyperfocal distance useless. So in this example, you can't use a hyperfocal distance. Okay, so I highly recommend that you play with these, so you can tell ahead of time what it is that you need. Okay, now what if you already play with it, all of it, but you just simply cannot get the whole picture in focus, no matter what you try? So now there's a method, and this you will see it thrown about quite a bit. is what we call focus stacking. And like the Canon EOS RP has a focus stacking feature, right? You look it up, I have a video for that. But anyway, even if you don't, right, all you have to do is take multiple pictures at different point of focus and then use post-processing to splice them together. Okay, very useful when you take micro picture, but you don't have to. Even landscape picture or anything else, you can use this to make sure you have everything in focus. Okay, to give you an example, I just lined up some pills that was lying around, and so I took a picture. So with the setting that I had, and I don't remember what that was, the focus is only in the first row. Okay, so I took one picture, focus on the first row. Second picture, I took it focus on the second row. Third picture, I took it focus on the third row, right? And then I used Photoshop, and I stacked them with Photoshop. It takes like, 30 seconds, and it gives me the final picture where everything's in focus. So that's called focus stack. All right, and that's the end of it. I hope that is of help to you. Give me a comment if you have any question, and then I'll be glad to answer. Thank you. And remember to subscribe and like. Thank you.